The autumn of 1878 brought an early frost to the Colorado Territory, painting the aspen leaves gold and crimson against the deep blue sky. Jonathan Hartwell sat on the porch of his one-room schoolhouse, watching the sun sink behind the mountains and wondering if he had made the right choice coming west. Back in Boston, he had been a respected professor of literature, with a comfortable life and the promise of tenure at Harvard. But the death of his young wife from consumption had left him hollow, and when the territorial government offered him a position teaching the children of miners and settlers in the remote town of Silver Creek, he had accepted without hesitation. The schoolhouse was simple but sturdy, built of pine logs and furnished with rough wooden desks that he had made himself. His students were a mixed group, the children of prospectors and ranchers, shopkeepers and drifters, all hungry for the education that might lift them above their circumstances. Jonathan took pride in his work, in the way young faces lit up when they grasped a difficult concept, in the careful letters they formed as they learned to write their names. But lately, he had noticed something that troubled him. Each day, just as the sun began its descent toward the mountains, a small figure would appear at the edge of the schoolyard. She was a girl of perhaps 10 years, with the dark hair and copper skin that marked her as one of the Ute people who had once claimed this entire valley as their homeland. She would stand perfectly still behind a large pine tree, watching the school with the intense concentration of a wild animal studying potential danger. Jonathan had tried several times to approach her, but she would disappear into the forest the moment he took a step in her direction. He had asked around town about her, but the response was always the same: a shrug, a muttered comment about the Indian problem, and a change of subject. The local Ute had been moved to a reservation 50 miles south, but a few families still lived in the mountains, keeping to themselves and causing no trouble. Today had been different. The girl had arrived earlier than usual, just as Jonathan was dismissing his students for the day. She had watched with obvious fascination as the children filed out, their voices carrying across the yard as they discussed their lessons. When the last child had gone, she had taken a few tentative steps closer, drawn by something she had seen or heard. Jonathan sat very still, afraid to startle her. She was small for her age, he realized, probably undernourished. Her clothes were a mixture of traditional buckskin and cast-off white man's clothing, carefully mended but showing signs of hard use. But what struck him most was her eyes, large, dark, and filled with an intelligence that seemed to burn like coals. They regarded each other across the schoolyard, teacher and student, separated by more than just physical distance. Jonathan could see the longing in her expression, the way she looked at the schoolhouse, as if it held secrets she desperately wanted to understand. Slowly, carefully, he reached into his jacket and pulled out a book, one of the few he had brought with him from Boston. "Would you like to hear a story?" he called out, his voice gentle and non-threatening. The girl's eyes widened, but she didn't run. Instead, she took another small step forward, then another. Jonathan opened the book to a page he knew by heart, one of the fairy tales that had always captivated his youngest students. "Once upon a time," he began, his voice carrying clearly across the still air, "in a kingdom far away there lived a princess who had never seen the outside world." He read slowly, dramatically, using all the skills he had learned in his years of teaching. The girl crept closer, drawn by the rhythm of his words, by the promise of stories that existed beyond her experience. By the time he reached the end of the tale, she was standing at the edge of the schoolyard, close enough that he could see the wonder in her eyes. "Did you like that story?" Jonathan asked softly. The girl nodded, a quick, almost involuntary motion. Then, as if suddenly remembering where she was, she turned and fled into the forest, leaving Jonathan alone with the echo of his own voice and the memory of that moment of connection. The next afternoon she was back, standing in the same spot but arriving earlier. This time, Jonathan was ready. He had selected another story, one of adventure and magic, and as soon as his students were gone, he began to read. The girl listened intently, her small face serious with concentration. When he finished, she lingered for a moment longer before disappearing into the trees. This became their routine. Each day, Jonathan would finish his regular lessons and then read to his invisible audience of one. He chose his stories carefully, selecting tales that would spark imagination and wonder, that would transport a lonely child to worlds beyond the harsh realities of frontier life. Gradually, the girl began to venture closer until she was standing just outside the schoolyard fence, close enough to see the pictures in his books. It was on the 5th day that she finally spoke. Jonathan had just finished reading The Little Match Girl, and as he closed the book he heard a small voice ask what happened to her family. Jonathan looked up to see the girl gripping the fence posts, her knuckles white with tension. The question revealed so much about her own circumstances, about the losses she had experienced, that Jonathan felt his heart constrict with sympathy. "The story doesn't say," he admitted, "but I think she was alone, like many children who have lost their families to sickness or war." The girl nodded gravely, understanding passing between them that needed no further explanation. "My name is Aiyana," she said softly. "It means eternal blossom in my language." "That's a beautiful name," Jonathan said. "I'm Mr. Hartwell, but you can call me Jonathan if you'd like." Aiyana tested the name silently, her lips moving as she practiced the unfamiliar sounds. "Jonathan," she said finally. "That is a strong name." "Thank you," Jonathan said, touched by the formal courtesy in her manner. "Would you like to come inside? I have more books and it's getting cold out here." Aiyana hesitated, looking toward the schoolhouse with obvious longing. "I am not supposed to go into white man's buildings," she said finally. "My grandfather says it is dangerous." "Your grandfather is wise to be cautious," Jonathan said, "but I promise you would be safe here. This is a place for learning, for all children." Aiyana considered this, her dark eyes studying his face, as if trying to read his intentions. Finally, she shook her head. "Not today, but tomorrow I will listen to more stories." True to her word, she returned the next day and the next. Gradually, their conversations grew longer, more personal. Jonathan learned that Aiyana lived with her grandfather, the last of their family after disease, and displacement had claimed the others. They survived by hunting, gathering, and occasionally trading with sympathetic settlers, but their existence was precarious. "Why do you come here?" Jonathan asked one afternoon, as they sat on opposite sides of the fence, a book of poetry open between them. Aiyana was quiet for a long moment, her fingers tracing patterns in the dirt. "I want to understand," she said finally. "The white men's words have power. They write things on paper, and it becomes law. They read from books, and people listen. I want to understand this power." Jonathan felt a chill that had nothing to do with the autumn air. This child had grasped something that many adults failed to understand, that literacy was more than just reading and writing. It was access to power, to the ability to navigate and influence the world around her. "I could teach you," he said quietly. "If you want to learn, I could teach you to read and write." Aiyana's eyes widened, hope and fear warring in her expression. "You would do this?" "It would be my honor," Jonathan said solemnly. "Every child deserves the chance to learn, to grow, to reach their full potential." The next day, Aiyana finally crossed the threshold of the schoolhouse. She moved like a deer entering a clearing, alert and ready to flee at the first sign of danger. But as she saw the books lining the walls, the slate boards covered with letters and numbers, the globe that showed the wider world beyond their valley, her fear gave way to wonder. "So many books," she whispered, her voice filled with awe. "And they all contain stories," Jonathan said, "stories of adventure and love, of far-off places and brave people. And someday you'll be able to read them all yourself." They started with the alphabet, Jonathan drawing letters in the dirt outside the schoolhouse, while Aiyana practiced forming them with a stick. She was a quick learner, her mind sharp and eager. Within weeks, she was reading simple words, her voice careful and proud as she sounded out each syllable. As the lessons progressed, Jonathan discovered that Aiyana had stories of her own to tell. She spoke of her people's history, of the time before the white men came, when the Ute had lived in harmony with the mountains and rivers. She told tales of brave warriors and wise women, of spirits that dwelt in the high places and ceremonies that connected her people to the land. "You should write these stories down," Jonathan suggested one day as they worked on her penmanship. "They're part of history, part of who you are." Aiyana looked up from her slate, her eyes bright with possibility. "I could do that. I could write my people's stories." "Of course," Jonathan said. "That's what writing is for, to preserve the important things, to share them with others." The idea seemed to energize her, and she threw herself into her studies with renewed determination. She learned to form letters into words, words into sentences, sentences into paragraphs. Her handwriting, initially shaky and uncertain, grew steady and confident. More importantly, she began to understand the power she had sensed in the written word. It was during one of these afternoon lessons that Jonathan first noticed the watchers. He glimpsed them through the window, shadows moving between the trees at the edge of the forest. At first, he thought they might be curious children, but the movements were too deliberate, too purposeful. Someone was observing their lessons, and they were being careful not to be seen. Aiyana noticed his distraction and followed his gaze. When she saw the figures in the forest, her face went pale, and she quickly gathered her materials. "I must go," she said, her voice tight with fear. "Aiyana, wait," Jonathan said, but she was already moving toward the door. "I cannot come tomorrow," she said over her shoulder, "maybe not for many days." She vanished into the forest, leaving Jonathan alone with a growing sense of unease. He had known that teaching Aiyana carried risks, that there were those on both sides who would disapprove of their arrangement. But seeing her fear, her sudden flight, made him realize just how precarious their situation truly was. That night, Jonathan lay awake thinking about the girl who had brought such purpose to his lonely existence. In teaching her, he had rediscovered his own love of learning, his passion for opening young minds to new possibilities. But he had also put her in danger, had perhaps forced her to choose between her people's ways and the knowledge he offered. The next morning dawned grey and cold, with the promise of winter in the air. Jonathan went through his regular lessons mechanically, his mind elsewhere. When the last student had left, he sat on the porch and waited, hoping against hope that Aiyana would appear. But the forest remained empty, and as the sun set behind the mountains, he finally accepted that she would not come. 3 days passed without any sign of her. Jonathan found himself distracted, unable to focus on his teaching. He had grown accustomed to their afternoon sessions, to the joy of watching understanding dawn in her eyes, to the stories she shared of her people's wisdom. Without her, the schoolhouse felt empty, purposeless. On the 4th morning, Jonathan woke to find his world transformed. During the night, a circle of traditional Ute lodges had appeared around the schoolhouse, their buffalo hide walls glowing softly in the dawn light. Horses grazed nearby, and the smoke of cooking fires drifted across the schoolyard. It was as if the mountain itself had given birth to a village. Jonathan dressed quickly and stepped outside, his heart pounding with a mixture of fear and anticipation. The lodges were arranged in a perfect circle, with the schoolhouse at the center, and he could see figures moving about their morning tasks. Men in traditional clothing tended to the horses, while women prepared food and children played quietly in the spaces between the lodges. As he stood on his porch, trying to process what he was seeing, a group of men approached the schoolhouse. They moved with the dignity of those accustomed to authority, their faces serious but not hostile. Leading them was an elderly man whose bearing spoke of wisdom and long experience. His hair was white and braided with feathers, and his clothes were decorated with intricate beadwork that told stories of his achievements. The group stopped at the base of the porch steps, and the elderly man spoke in Ute, his voice carrying clearly across the still air. Then, to Jonathan's surprise, he continued in careful English. "I am Grey Wolf, grandfather to the child you call Aiyana. I've come to speak with the teacher who reads stories to lonely children." Jonathan felt his mouth go dry. This was the moment he had been dreading. The confrontation he had known must come. "I am Jonathan Hartwell," he said, his voice steadier than he felt. "I am honored to meet you." Grey Wolf studied him for a long moment, his dark eyes seeming to look into Jonathan's soul. "You have been teaching my granddaughter the white man's writing," he said. It was not a question. "Yes," Jonathan admitted. "She wanted to learn, and I thought—" Grey Wolf raised a hand, silencing him. "I did not come to hear excuses," he said. "I came to see the man who made my granddaughter's eyes shine with happiness for the first time since her parents died." Jonathan felt a jolt of surprise. This was not the angry confrontation he had expected. "I don't understand." "For many moons, the child has been like a shadow," Grey Wolf continued. "She ate little, spoke less, showed no interest in the world around her. But since she began coming to your lodge of learning, she has become alive again. She speaks of letters and words, of stories from far places. She practices making marks on bark, trying to capture the words you have taught her." One of the younger men stepped forward, his face stern but not unfriendly. "I am Standing Bear, war chief of our band. We have been watching you, teacher. We have seen how you treat the child, how you speak to her with respect." Jonathan nodded, beginning to understand. "You've been protecting her." "We have been protecting both of you," Standing Bear said. "There are those among your people who would not approve of what you have been doing. There are those among our people who would see it as betrayal." Grey Wolf moved closer, his weathered face grave. "But we have watched, and we have listened. We have seen that you offer knowledge without asking her to abandon her people's ways. We have seen that you honor her stories as much as your own. She is a remarkable child," Jonathan said sincerely, "intelligent, curious, eager to learn. It has been my privilege to teach her." "And it has been her privilege to learn from you," Grey Wolf replied. "But now we must speak of what comes next." Jonathan felt his heart sink. "Are you taking her away?" "That depends," Grey Wolf said, "on what you are willing to do." The old man gestured toward the circle of lodges. "These are the survivors of our band, all that remain of a people who once numbered in the thousands. We have been living in the high country, trying to keep our ways alive while the world changes around us, but we cannot hide forever." Standing Bear took up the explanation. "The white man's government says our children must go to their schools, must learn their ways. They say we must give up our language, our customs, our beliefs. They say this is the only way our people can survive. But you offer something different," Grey Wolf said, his eyes fixed on Jonathan. "You offer learning without loss, knowledge without surrender. You teach the child to read and write, but you do not tell her to forget who she is." Jonathan began to understand the magnitude of what they were proposing. "You want me to teach all of them?" "We want you to help us find a new way," Grey Wolf said. "A way for our children to learn what they need to know to survive in the white man's world, while still remaining true to their own people." The proposal was staggering, both in its implications and in the trust it represented. These people, who had every reason to distrust white men and their promises, were offering to entrust their children's education to him. They were asking him to help them navigate between two worlds, to find a path that preserved their culture while preparing their young for an uncertain future. "I would be honored," Jonathan said finally, "but I should tell you there will be opposition. The government, the local settlers, they may not approve of what we're doing." Standing Bear's expression hardened. "Let them come. We are not afraid of their disapproval. But we are not fools either," Grey Wolf added. "We know this will be difficult, dangerous perhaps. That is why we propose something that has never been tried before. He gestured toward the lodges again. "We will stay here for the winter, close enough to protect the school, but far enough to avoid trouble. Our children will learn from you during the day, but they will return to their families at night. They will learn your language and your numbers, but they will also learn our stories and our ways." "A school for both worlds," Jonathan said, the beauty of the concept taking his breath away. "Exactly," Grey Wolf said, "and you, teacher, will be the bridge between them." Over the following days, Jonathan discovered what it meant to be that bridge. The Ute children were unlike any students he had ever taught. They were respectful, but not submissive, eager to learn, but not willing to abandon their own knowledge. They absorbed letters and numbers with the same intensity they brought to learning to track animals or read weather signs. Aiyana became his unofficial assistant, helping to translate when the younger children struggled with English, demonstrating that learning the white man's ways did not mean losing her own identity. She had grown more confident since her people's arrival, her shoulders straighter, her voice clearer. "Are you happy?" Jonathan asked her one afternoon, as they worked on a story she was writing about her grandmother's healing remedies. Aiyana looked up from her slate, her dark eyes thoughtful. "I am complete," she said finally. "Before, I was split in two. Part of me wanted to learn your ways. Part of me wanted to stay with my people. Now I can be both." Jonathan nodded, understanding more than she might have realized. He too had been split, torn between his love of teaching and his grief over his lost life in Boston. But here, in this unlikely school at the edge of the wilderness, he had found a way to honor both his past and his future. The winter brought challenges none of them had anticipated. Word of the unusual school spread to the territorial capital, and Jonathan received a stern letter from the Bureau of Indian Affairs demanding an explanation. Local ranchers complained about the Indian presence near town, and there were rumors of efforts to have the Ute removed by force, but there were also unexpected allies. A few of the local settlers, impressed by the peaceful coexistence they witnessed, began to speak in favor of the experiment. The children of Silver Creek, both white and Ute, were learning together, playing together, forming friendships that transcended racial boundaries. "Look at them," Jonathan said to Grey Wolf one afternoon, as they watched a group of children building a snow fort together, their laughter echoing across the schoolyard. "They don't see differences the way adults do." Grey Wolf nodded, his weathered face soft with affection. "Children are born knowing that all people are the same underneath. It is only later that they learn to fear and hate." "Then maybe there's hope," Jonathan said. "Maybe this generation can build something better than what we've given them." "Perhaps," Grey Wolf agreed, "but only if we show them how." The test came in early spring, when a delegation from the territorial government arrived to investigate the school. Jonathan had been expecting them, but he was surprised to find that the group included not only government officials, but also representatives from several Eastern universities who had heard about the unique educational experiment. Dr. Charles Morrison from Columbia University was particularly interested in the bilingual approach Jonathan had developed. "You're teaching them to read and write in both English and Ute?" he asked, examining the children's work. "The children need to maintain their connection to their own culture," Jonathan explained, "but they also need the tools to function in the wider world. By honoring both languages, we're creating students who can serve as bridges between the two communities." The government officials were less impressed. "The policy of the Bureau of Indian Affairs is clear," stated Agent Williams. "Indian children must be assimilated into American society. That means English only, Christian education, and the abandonment of savage customs." "With respect," Jonathan said, his voice calm but firm, "I've seen no savage customs here. I've seen children who are respectful, hard-working, and eager to learn. I've seen families who value education and community. I've seen people who have managed to maintain their dignity in the face of unimaginable loss." Standing Bear, who had been silent during the discussion, finally spoke up. "You speak of assimilation. he said to Agent Williams. "But what you mean is surrender. You want us to become white men with red skin. You want us to forget our ancestors, our stories, our connection to the land." "That is the price of progress," Williams replied coldly. "No," Grey Wolf said, rising from his chair with the dignity of a man who had led his people through decades of hardship. "That is the price of fear. You are afraid of what you do not understand, so you seek to destroy it." Dr. Morrison leaned forward, his scholarly interest clearly piqued. "But what if there was another way? What if we could create a model that preserves indigenous culture while providing the tools for success in modern society?" "That's exactly what we're doing here," Jonathan said. "These children are learning mathematics and literature, history and science, but they're also learning their people's traditional knowledge, their languages, their ceremonies. They're becoming citizens of both worlds." The debate continued for hours, but in the end, it was the children themselves who made the strongest argument. Aiyana, now fluent in both spoken and written English, stood before the delegation and spoke with a poise that belied her young age. "I know who I am," she said, her voice clear and strong. "I am Ute, daughter of the mountain people, granddaughter of healers and storytellers. But I'm also a student, a reader, a writer. I can solve problems with numbers and create beauty with words. I can honor my ancestors while preparing for the future." She paused, looking directly at Agent Williams. "You say I must choose between my people's ways and the white man's learning. But why must I choose? Why can I not be both?" The question hung in the air like a challenge, and Jonathan felt his heart swell with pride. This was what education was supposed to do, not just fill young minds with facts, but teach them to think critically, to question assumptions, to articulate their own truths. Dr. Morrison was clearly impressed. "Young lady, that was beautifully said. You've articulated the core principle of what we might call cultural synthesis, the idea that different ways of knowing can complement rather than compete with each other." Even Agent Williams seemed taken aback by Aiyana's eloquence. "The girl speaks well," he admitted grudgingly, "but individual success doesn't change the broader policy imperatives." "Perhaps it should," said another voice from the doorway. Jonathan turned to see a woman in traveling clothes, her bearing suggesting both authority and compassion. "I am Dr. Sarah Hamilton from the Women's Educational Association. I've been following the reports of this school with great interest." Dr. Hamilton moved into the room, her keen eyes taking in the scene. "I've spent the last 2 days observing classes, speaking with families, and evaluating the educational outcomes. What I've found is remarkable. Children who are not only academically advanced, but also emotionally and culturally grounded." She turned to Agent Williams. "Sir, I understand your concerns about policy, but I would submit that this school is achieving the very goals that government policy claims to support. These children are learning to function in American society without losing their essential humanity." The delegation spent another week in Silver Creek, observing classes, interviewing families, and documenting the school's methods. When they finally departed, they left behind a provisional agreement that would allow the school to continue operating while a formal study was conducted. "We did it," Jonathan said to Grey Wolf, as they watched the government wagons disappear over the horizon. "We actually did it," Grey Wolf smiled, a rare expression on his weathered face. "We have won a battle, not a war. But it is a good beginning." The school continued to grow and evolve over the following years. More Ute families joined the community, drawn by the promise of education that honored their heritage. Students began to graduate and move on to higher education, some attending universities in the East, others returning to serve their communities as teachers and leaders. Aiyana was among the first to graduate, her valedictorian speech delivered in both English and Ute. She went on to attend Teachers College, then returned to establish similar schools in other native communities. Her story became a symbol of what was possible when education was viewed as a bridge rather than a weapon. "Do you remember," she asked Jonathan during one of her visits, "the first story you read to me?" Jonathan smiled, remembering the frightened child who had hidden behind a tree, hungry for knowledge but afraid to reach for it. "The princess who had never seen the outside world," he said. "I think about that story often," Aiyana said. "The princess was trapped in her tower, unable to experience the world beyond her walls, but she was also protected by those walls, kept safe from the dangers outside." "And what did you learn from that story?" Aiyana's eyes sparkled with the same intelligence that had first drawn him to her. "I learned that the answer isn't to tear down the walls or to hide behind them forever. The answer is to build doors, ways to move between worlds while remaining true to yourself." Jonathan nodded, understanding that this was the true legacy of their work. They had not just created a school, but a model for how different cultures could coexist and enrich each other. They had shown that education could be a tool of empowerment rather than oppression, of synthesis rather than assimilation. As the years passed, the Silver Creek School became a beacon for educators and policymakers from around the world. Visitors came to study their methods, to understand how they had managed to create a learning environment that honored both indigenous wisdom and contemporary knowledge. But for Jonathan, the true measure of success was simpler and more personal. It was the light in a child's eyes when they grasped a difficult concept, the pride in a parent's voice when they spoke of their child's achievements, the confidence of young people who knew they could succeed in any world they chose to enter. He had come to Silver Creek as a broken man, seeking to lose himself in the vastness of the frontier. Instead, he had found purpose, community, and a love that transcended the boundaries of race and culture. The lonely professor had become the center of a movement that would influence educational policy for generations to come. On quiet evenings, when the last lesson was finished and the children had returned to their families, Jonathan would sit on the porch of the schoolhouse and watch the sun set behind the mountains. The circle of lodges remained, a symbol of the bridge they had built between worlds. Smoke rose from cooking fires, children played in the gathering dusk, and the sound of laughter echoed across the valley. Grey Wolf would often join him, the two old men sitting in comfortable silence as they watched their community thrive. They had taken enormous risks, challenged entrenched systems, and faced down opposition from both sides. But they had also created something beautiful and lasting, a place where knowledge was shared freely, where different ways of understanding the world were celebrated rather than suppressed, where children could grow up whole and unafraid. "No child should have to choose between their heritage and their future," Jonathan said one evening as they watched Aiyana's own children playing with their classmates. Grey Wolf nodded, his eyes reflecting the wisdom of years. "You gave my granddaughter something precious," he said. "You gave her the gift of belonging to both worlds without being diminished by either." "She gave me something precious too," Jonathan replied. "She gave me the chance to be the teacher I always meant to be." The legacy of the Silver Creek School would endure long after its founders were gone. The children who learned there would carry its lessons into the wider world, becoming doctors and lawyers, teachers and leaders, bridging the gap between cultures with the confidence born of understanding both. They would remember the place where they learned that difference was not something to be feared, but celebrated, where wisdom could be found in many forms, and where the simple act of reading a story to a lonely child could change the course of history. In the end, Jonathan Hartwell had not just taught a girl to read. He had opened a door between worlds, and generations of children had walked through it into a future bright with possibility. The professor who had come west to escape his grief had instead found his greatest purpose, proving that sometimes the most profound changes begin with the smallest acts of kindness.